Hello, this is Dan Hickey. I'm coming to you today from my office in the Wright School of Education at Indiana University. This is the fourth in a series of short videos about the practices, principles, and policies that make up the discipline of educational assessment. Today, I'm going to talk to you about creating effective performance assessments. Performance assessment is near and dear to my heart. I did my postdoctoral training at the Center for Performance Assessment at Educational Testing Service in Princeton. While ETS is most well known in the U.S. for their multiple choice tests like the SAT, they were also involved in the first wave of assessment reform in the 1990s. Some of you may recall in the U.S. there was a wave of assessment reform in the 1990s where performance assessments were introduced. That frankly didn't go very well. It went terribly actually, and paved the way for the No Child Left Behind and the move back to more conventional assessment formats. Many of you may know that there's a big push to new assessments in the U.S. starting in 2013. About half of the U.S. states will be using sophisticated computer-based performance assessments. And it's going to be a grand experiment. We're going to see how it's going, if we can overcome some of the problems that were encountered in the 90s. At the core of this type of assessment, the instructor observes the test taker's process of constructing an original response. When scoring, the test taker's performance and the instructor's judgment of performance is taken into consideration. This is a really important part about performance assessments. These assessments go by various names. Some people like to call them authentic assessments, but I think that's misleading. It really overlooks the fact that different views of learning lead to different sort of characterizations of what it means to have an authentic assessment. Most importantly, they're different than portfolio assessment that I will discuss in a separate video. That's because performance assessments are on-demand tasks. You sit someone down, you give them a structured assignment, and generally speaking, most students will be completing the same task. In my own research, I've used fairly complex performance assessments. I often give some sort of a scenario or a task, and then I'll have multiple items. I'll have maybe a constructed response, even some multiple choice, and then a longer essay. One format that I've used that's worked very well is where I have a short answer where I'm looking for a single one or two word response, and then I ask students to provide some rationale that explains how they came to that response. That's a very effective format for getting at both the specific stuff, but then also seeing how far students can go. Generally speaking, three features distinguish performance assessments from other types of assessment. First, the performance must be judged on multiple evaluative criteria. For instance, a speech might be judged by the content of the speech, the verbal and nonverbal delivery of the speech, and the speaker's appearance. Second, the standards by which the test taker will be judged must be pre-specified and communicated to the test taker ahead of the performance. Finally, performance tasks are appraised judgmentally. While this is starting to change with the new computer-administered task, generally speaking, human judgment will be involved. What's different with the new computer-based tasks is there actually is human judgment built in. They're using very sophisticated statistical techniques to make inferences much the same way that the humans will. You're probably not going to be doing this in your assessments, at least not any time in the near future. It's quite a difficult challenge to create those items. Let's talk about suitable tasks for performance assessments. One of the downsides of performance assessment is you really can only include a few tasks because they take so long to complete. Obviously, the task should be derived from the curricular aim. Unlike portfolio assessment, there's not an expectation that students are actually learning while they're completing the task beyond constructing the understanding that they need to do to generate the response. Third, the task should allow the instructor to make inferences about the test taker's ability to meet that curricular aim. Now, you should be getting a sense about the issues I raised in my earlier video about the importance of the curricular aim. It's really easy to lose sight of the curricular aim and focus directly on the task. But you don't want your performance assessment task to be identical to your curricular context. Usually, you want to know if the student can solve a somewhat different problem in a somewhat different context. The exception is activities like music or dance where you can directly assess student competency. Because I don't use performance assessments in my own assessment class, it's a little difficult for me to give you an example. It might be a bit of a stretch, but it's going to let me explain some of the points on the previous slide and the guidelines for evaluating performance tasks on the next slide. Take a second and read my prompt. So you can see it has a small number of tasks, and it's directly derived from one of my curricular aims that I have about understanding the guidelines. This might allow me to make some inferences about whether somebody understands the guidelines well enough to use them. However, I might not be sure whether they understood all of the guidelines just because they made a mistake. The important point here is that my task is somewhat different than the tasks students were doing in my class. If I let students select their own task for their assignments, then they could just use the ones that they had developed previously. And that would be hard to score because they'd be so different from one student to the next. But you see my point. Let's use my example to consider the guidelines that Jim Popham and others like him have put out for evaluating performance tasks. The first guideline is whether the current task that you're using in your assessment generalizes to other similar tasks. Don't use tasks that are so unique and specialized that you can't make inferences about how students would perform in future settings. I'm honestly not sure how generalizable my task would be. Second, the task should be authentic, meaning that it's similar to what the test taker might encounter in the real world. So I'm not really sure. That's not that much different having students do this performance task in an on-demand setting. Again, I don't use performance tasks in my assessment class. I just made up that example for this point. The kind of question you want to ask yourself is what kind of resources you want students to have access to while they're completing a performance task. For example, it really wouldn't make sense to withhold the guidelines from the students while they're completing their test because there would be no reason to do that in the real world. That would make that an inauthentic performance task. Third, as discussed before, your performance task should have multiple foci. Even if you score the task holistically, it should be possible to break it down analytically. My task has 10 guidelines, but it's really a bit of a stretch in this regard. Now, I guess I could score my performance task using the 5 general guidelines and the 5 specific guidelines. That might be a bit of a stretch, but I could probably give it a try. Fourth, the task should be teachable, so that what you're measuring is an outcome of your instructional effort. Again, don't make it too similar to the instruction, or you really won't be capturing what cognitive psychologists call transfer. Now, I certainly know that the guidelines are learnable and teachable. I'm pretty confident that a student who never took my class would really have a hard time completing that performance task within the 30 minutes time. Now, if I gave them a day or made it a take-home one, most knowledgeable adults could probably make sense. Certainly most educators could make sense of those guidelines. And I wouldn't know whether people had learned very much in advance. Fifth, the test should be fair to all students and not biased against any student in terms of background, gender, ethnicity, or socioeconomic status. But it should also not be biased towards different domains. Consider that if I were to have chosen an example from social studies for my example test, that item would have been biased towards teachers who were familiar or teaching social studies and against everyone else. There's also bias that can creep into performance tasks in terms of their alignment with particular curriculum. We have to think a great deal about the relationship between the kinds of problems students are solving during class and the kinds of problems you're asking them to solve on the performance task. Let's talk about the scoring criteria. Scoreability can be examined by thinking about and creating the evaluative criteria while developing the performance task. The evaluative criteria will be used to make a judgment about the test taker's performance. You're going to want to create a rubric, and there's 3 kinds of rubrics that you'll probably be thinking about. There's 3 different types of rubrics out there. They're very different, and some of them work a lot better than others. Popham calls them task-specific, hyper-general, and skill-focused rubrics. Task-specific rubrics are created to measure the test taker's performance on a single task, the actual task being performed. In the case of my example, I guess this would focus on the very specific type of assessment and not worry about the guidelines. While this might seem like a suitable way to assess a performance task, remember that the scoring criteria are created along with the creation of the task and should help guide your instruction. Therefore, a task-specific rubric can cause a teacher to teach to the very specific task, and that reduces the generalizability of the student's evidence. Remember that generalizability is one of the key elements to a good performance assessment, so you might want to deter from using this type of rubric unless you're working with performance like music that can be directly assessed. On the other extreme is what Popham calls a hypergeneral rubric. This rubric describes evaluative criteria in very general terms such as superior, proficient, adequate, and seeming to make the task more generalizable. However, this type of rubric does not guide the instruction because it's too general and the terms are really very vague. In the case of my example, I might say, well, if the assessment is good, then you're proficient, and if it's not, then you get a lower score. Most assessment experts recommend using what's called a skill-focused rubric. Here are 5 guidelines for constructing skill-focused rubrics. First, the skills to be assessed should be significant to student learning. Second, all the criteria should be criteria that can be addressed in your instruction. With those guidelines in mind, you should use as few evaluative criteria as possible so that your instruction and student learning is focused and neither you nor the students get overwhelmed with the details. Fourth, you should create distinct labels for each criteria so that you and your students have a shared vocabulary with which to discuss the criteria. Finally, be sure to keep yourself and your preferences in mind. As an instructor, create the rubrics that work for you. In particular, You want to play around with detail. Find the level that's right for your time, and especially think about the stakes of the assessment. If it's a low stakes assessment, you don't need to be nearly as detailed and spend nearly as much time. The final consideration in scoring student performance tasks are the possible sources of error in assigning scores. Remember, even though the scoring guide is guided by a rubric, performance tasks are scored subjectively, and the instructor has to make a judgment. Therefore, errors can and do occur. The first type of error comes in flaws in the scoring instrument. This is why it's so important to construct and try out your rubric in advance. The second type of error are procedural flaws. These can occur when unclear instructions for a task are given, too many criteria are being scored at one time, or too many test takers are being scored at one time. To eliminate this type of error, these factors need to be thought out before a performance task is created. But you also want to keep in mind that if you don't have time, you might just not want to use this time-consuming format. You certainly don't want to make those kinds of mistakes when the stakes are high. Finally, instructors might introduce bias into scoring, often doing so accidentally. There are 4 types of bias error. My good friend Ed Wolf, who I worked with at ETS, did his dissertation and spent much of his career studying these kinds of biases in large-scale essay and performance assessment. Because human scoring is so expensive, mistakes can be quite costly. But scoring will take educators a lot of time, so you really want to be careful to avoid these common biases. Generosity error happens when the instructor scores a test taker higher than they deserved. The opposite is severity, which happens when the instructor underrates the individual performance. Ed Wolf calls this leniency and harshness. The central tendency error occurs when the instructor gives everyone a median score and does not spread it out to the high or low ratings. A lot of times people want to do this to be fair, but it really takes away the whole purpose. If everybody gets a 4 out of 5 points, you're likely not seeing variation that's really there. The last personal bias error is the so-called halo effect that happens when the instructor's favorable attitude towards one student causes that score to be more favorable than is warranted. This can be avoided by scoring anonymously and by having rubrics and tasks that are well designed. That's all for now on creating effective performance assessments. I hope you find this information useful. One thing I didn't talk about today in this video is formative feedback. One of the really useful things about performance tasks is fostering what my friend Drew Jitomer calls assessment conversations. This is where students engage in disciplinary discourse around the responses that they give to performance tasks. If the stakes are low and you're really trying to help students learn, sometimes just a modest number of points and then an opportunity to discuss answers can be really helpful. So I'll return to that later. Thanks. Bye for now.